Synod, I'm delighted to welcome Jill Baker, former Vice President of the Methodist Conference, currently Chair of the Methodist Council. Here today because of a particular interest that she has in pilgrimage, and Jill has supported us in the district on a couple of occasions over the past year at the Probationers Retreat and in a Ministers' Reflection Group, where she's helped us reflect on that theme. Jill, when you met with ministers in March, you quoted Richard Niebuhr, who described pilgrims as persons in motion, passing through territories not their own and seeking another shore, a shore that will complete us. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your personal understanding and experience of pilgrimage and why it's so important to you.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I suppose if I'm honest, I didn't give pilgrimage much thought for most of my life. I probably thought of it as a glorified, spiritualized holiday. But yeah, over the last 9 years, really, pilgrimage has crept up on me and I would say taken me captive. And for me, that does begin in tragedy. It begins with the suicide of our younger son, Peter, in 2012. And as you may imagine, that rocked the foundations of my life. In all the grief and the heartbreak, I think I was always conscious that God was there. But I would say in a raw and visceral way, which was different from my encounters with God up to that point. And I've said since that I needed God to be bigger and wilder than the God I'd known up until then. And we might come back later to what that means. Over the next couple of years, various things happened. Lots of things happened. You might say randomly, you might say serendipitously, you might say providentially. But they led to me organising and leading pilgrim groups along various routes, most often to Lindisfarne in your part of the country, also to Palestine, Israel, to Rome, and here in Scotland to some extent. I've done over the years a great deal of reading about pilgrimage and talked to many others and trying to do a little writing too. And wanting more than anything to capture something of the essence of being a pilgrim, which I think applies to the whole of life, not just to a particular journey or a destination. Pilgrimage had a bad press for a long time, partly because it was seen as a sort of spiritual elitism, and it still can be that if we're not careful. So you certainly won't find me saying that every Christian needs to go on a pilgrimage. But I know that for me, being on pilgrimage, and especially walking with others on that northeast coast of England, has, if you like, been the classroom in which I have learned pilgrim attitudes, learned lessons for life.
Thanks, Jill. I mean, it feels a bit like we're in a classroom at the moment as we emerge from the pandemic. We're learning to walk again one step at a time. Do you think pilgrimage has anything to teach us as we reorientate ourselves as we emerge from this period?
Oh, absolutely. Left foot, right foot. It's the building block of pilgrimage. It's where all our journeys start, and it's the only way any journey is made, like breathing in and breathing out. Sometimes, especially in times of crisis, all we can do is focus on the next tiny step. And I know, looking back at the groups I've led, I've sometimes sat in my room at Durham the first evening as I've met the new group and we're preparing to set off walking, and I must confess using trains. We don't walk all the way from Durham to Lindisfarne. As I've pondered that journey, I've just wanted to be at the point where we make that wonderful crossing by the Pilgrim Poles and we arrive on Lindisfarne. But I've had to tell myself there's only one way to get there, and that's to walk to Durham Station tomorrow morning and to start the step-by-step process. It's the only way to do it, to take the next step and then the next and then the next. And I mentioned pilgrim attitudes for life earlier. Perhaps it is those sort of attitudes that we need to look to now. And they're not always comfortable attitudes. Restlessness is a really key word for me. Not expecting to feel comfortable or at home or settled. We're in new territory now and we shouldn't expect to feel familiar with it. That wonderful word liminality, which perhaps picks up on the Richard Niebuhr quotation you mentioned earlier, learning to live in transition in between two lands, in between two spheres. Words like courage and risk and adventure, learning to cope when things go wrong. I have to admit I'm not very good at that. I'm a very organised person. I like to plan very thoroughly, but on the road, you have to adapt sometimes to unexpected events like pandemics. And maybe one of the tensions, particular tensions around pilgrimage is helpful to us now. It's about destination. Does pilgrimage need a destination or not? And there's lots of factors on both sides of that question. Clearly, most organised pilgrimages do have a destination or they couldn't operate. But I don't want to lose sight of the spirit of those early Celtic saints who pushed off from land in little coracles and let the tides and the winds take them where they may. Perhaps the church is in that position at the moment. It's hard to visualise what our destination might be, but perhaps we need to learn to live more by the Spirit. I know as Methodists we like to be methodical, but that mustn't squeeze out the Spirit.
Thank you. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, Jill, and also one of the reasons you came to the reflection group was, I guess, a chance remark when you said you really wanted to write something on Methodist pilgrimage. And in some ways that doesn't seem an obvious comparison. In other ways, there are real kind of resonances in the Methodist experience. And I wonder if there are aspects of Methodist identity that you feel particularly resonate with the idea of pilgrimage.
Yes, thanks, Richard. I do. I mean, as you say, pilgrimage has been more associated with Roman Catholicism and perhaps Anglicanism over the centuries, but it's very interesting to look at Methodism and pilgrimage together. There's no evidence that Wesley ever went on a pilgrimage, nor even that he ever wrote about pilgrimage, but perhaps that's not so surprising given the kind of profile which pilgrimage had in his day. Some of you might have read Jonathan Hustler's pastoral letter for this new year, which recalls the early Methodist symbolism of the scallop shell, a pilgrim symbol, probably, as Jonathan says in the letter, because it features in the personal crest of the Wesleys, but no one really knows what it was doing there. But journeying is at the heart of Methodism. Think of our language, circuits, years of travel, sitting down, itinerancy. And some of the greatest of our Methodist hymns pick up on this idea of travel, don't they? Captain of Israel's Host is perhaps the best example. But the section in Singing the Faith, Our Journey with God, is almost the longest section in the book because we are at heart a movement. So we do need to retain flexible structures and fluid boundaries, not seek to fall into that more settled parochial model, which is not the essence of Methodism. In Wesley's days, I guess it was ministers and preachers who travelled whilst congregations largely stayed put. The world's very different now. Maybe we need to harness all the energy which is there in our congregations and allow that to make us the dynamic church that we really could be.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, the title of our synod is Making the Way as we Walk, and just this idea of John Wesley making the way as he rode. And maybe there's a kind of a parallel in terms of, because Methodism didn't arrive fully formed in his day. It's something that emerged, I guess, in his experience. There's also something about that early Methodist vision that is wild and big. And you mentioned earlier about needing a God who is bigger and wilder. I mean, what do you mean by that, and what challenges do you think that presents to us as individuals, but for me particularly as a synod?
What do I mean by that? I'm still living it out, really, and trying to discover it, because there's a real tension here in me for all my own tendencies to tidiness and to order. Yet I really do believe that God has an affinity with wildness, wind, water, fire, sky, wild geese, waterfalls, buzzards. They all speak, don't they, of God's restless energy. So just to finish perhaps with a story, I have a terrible sense of direction, and it amuses me continually that I've felt this sense of call into leading pilgrimages. So the first time I was due to take a group of women to Lindisfarne, I was quite nervous about losing the way. So before I left home with that first group, my husband Andrew said, "I have a blessing for your pilgrimage. May the sea be always on your right." And that's great if you're going up the northeast coast of England. So anyway, between leading the various groups that I've taken on that route, I would always want to check out the route again myself to make sure it hadn't changed or I hadn't forgotten it. And on one occasion, Andrew and I were walking to Lindisfarne in February during Storm Frank. You remember Storm Frank? So we decided that it wouldn't be safe to use the pilgrim path across the sands to get to the island, that we would need to walk, be sensible and walk on the road. But somehow when we reached those poles in very strong winds, we both found ourselves taking off our shoes, rolling up our trousers and setting off into the mud. The wind, thankfully, was at our backs, and we were blown across that route in about 40 minutes. I normally allow an hour and a half for the journey, including stopping to pray and sing. And it was an absolutely exhilarating and totally memorable experience, which, if I'm honest, are not words I very often use about experiences in church or in wider Methodism. Exhilarating, memorable. We felt as if we were being taken to another world, that shore that will complete us, as Niebuhr says in that quotation. So I wonder, how can I live more wildly, live in the wildness of God, perhaps as a synod, as a connection, as a Methodist council? We just need to allow a little more of God's wind to fill our sails and sweep us into a new world.
It's wonderful. Thank you, Jill. It's a really encouraging message for Synod, and thank you, and a blessing on your continuing work, and hopefully one day a book on Methodism and pilgrimage. We look forward to that.
Maybe one day, yes, don't hold your breath. Thanks very much, Richard. Good to see you all.